Imagine a conflict that's been brewing for thousands of years, one that began not with politics or borders, but with a promise from God Himself. What if the ongoing struggle between Israel and the Arab nations is more than just about land? What if it's about divine inheritance and a battle over God's covenant? Welcome to a deep dive into one of the most persistent conflicts in world history, the Arab-Israeli conflict. Today we'll explore its true origins, which stretch back to the time of Abraham and his two sons. This is a battle of legacy, prophecy, and divine election that's been playing out for millennia. We'll uncover the biblical foundation of the conflict, from God's covenant with Abraham to the divisions between Isaac and Ishmael. Along the way, we'll explore how these ancient promises still fuel the tensions we see today, and why true peace will only come when Christ returns. 1. The beginning of the conflict, Abraham's sons and the promise. The story of the Arab-Israeli conflict is deeply rooted in the Bible, beginning with the figure of Abraham, a man whom God called to be the father of many nations. Abraham, originally named Abram, was promised by God that his descendants would inherit the land. But this promise wasn't simply about land or a nation. It was about God's covenant, which would be fulfilled through a chosen line. Abraham's story marks the beginning of a spiritual inheritance that still affects us today. Abraham's wife, Sarai, had been unable to have children. As the years passed, Sarai grew older, and the promise of a son seemed to be slipping further away. In her impatience and doubt, Sarai decided to give her maidservant Hagar to Abraham, believing that perhaps through Hagar, Abraham could have a child. This decision was born out of human effort and a lack of faith in God's timing, and it would lead to unintended consequences that would echo throughout history. Hagar became pregnant, and the tensions within Abraham's household quickly escalated. Sarai, who had been barren for so long, became jealous of Hagar's pregnancy and began to treat her with contempt. Hagar fled into the wilderness, feeling rejected and humiliated, but God did not abandon her. He found her in the desert, comforting her and offering a prophecy about her son. God told Hagar that her son, Ishmael, would become a great nation, but his life would be marked by struggle. He shall be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. Genesis 16:12. God's words were not just a description of Ishmael's personal life, but a prophecy about the future of his descendants. Ishmael would not be the son of the promise, but God still blessed him. He would grow into a mighty man, the father of 12 princes, and his descendants would spread across the Middle East, forming nations. However, God made it clear that the covenant, the special promise that Abraham had been given, would not pass through Ishmael. The very next chapter in Genesis 17, reveals that God would keep his promise to Abraham and Sarah. Despite their doubts and failures, God's plan remained intact. At the age of 99, God reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham, telling him that Sarah would bear a son, and that this son would carry the covenant. This child would be named Isaac. God says to Abraham in Genesis 17:19-21, "Your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." Isaac was to be the child of promise, and through him, the covenant would continue. The moment of Isaac's birth marked a profound spiritual truth. The promises of God are not given based on human effort or manipulation, but by divine will and election. While Ishmael was blessed, his role in God's plan was distinct from that of Isaac. This marks the beginning of a deep division between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, a division that would become a defining feature of history. The tension between these two brothers intensified further after Isaac's birth. When Isaac was weaned, a feast was held, and during this celebration, Ishmael mocked Isaac. Sarai, sensing a threat to her son's inheritance, demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be cast out. God instructed Abraham to listen to Sarah, for it was through Isaac that Abraham's offspring would be named. Genesis 21:10-12. This moment was pivotal. It was not just a matter of personal family dynamics, it was about divine election. The covenant promise would pass through Isaac, not Ishmael. In Abraham's obedience, God made it clear that the future of the chosen people would not rest on human desires or what seemed right in human eyes. God's will was clear, and his plan was unfolding in ways that humans could not fully understand at the time. Ishmael and his mother, Hagar, were sent away, and though they faced hardships in the wilderness, God continued to bless them. Ishmael's life became a struggle for survival, just as God had prophesied. But God also promised Hagar that her son would be a great nation. Even in the wilderness, God's mercy was evident, and his promises remained true. Ishmael was not forgotten, but he was not the chosen vessel for God's redemptive plan. This division between Isaac and Ishmael, one chosen and one not, set the stage for centuries of conflict. The descendants of Isaac, the Jewish people, carried the covenant and the promise of the land, while the descendants of Ishmael, the Arabs, would struggle with the rejection of their own inheritance. But God's promises were still in play for both nations. The tension between Isaac and Ishmael, however, would continue to shape history, fueling not just political struggles, but spiritual battles as well. In reflecting on this story, we must understand the deeper spiritual truths at play. God's plan is not always easy for us to comprehend. His choices may seem difficult or even unfair at times, but we must trust that his ways are perfect. The conflict between Isaac and Ishmael is not just about two brothers. It's a reflection of a larger divine narrative, one that ultimately points to the fulfillment of God's promise through Jesus Christ. As believers, we are called to trust in God's plan for our lives, even when it feels difficult, because his ultimate goal is redemption and reconciliation through his Son. The conflict that began between Isaac and Ishmael has evolved, but its spiritual roots remain. This tension over God's promise and the rightful heirs continues to this day, not just in terms of land, but in the deeper spiritual battle for the legacy of the covenant. Understanding the biblical origins of this conflict gives us insight into the heart of the struggle and challenges us to view the world through the lens of God's divine plan. 2. The consequences of rejection, Ishmael's exile, and the prophecy. After Isaac's birth, the tension between the two brothers, Isaac and Ishmael, continued to grow. The turning point came when Isaac was weaned, and a feast was held to celebrate. During the celebration, Ishmael mocked Isaac. This act of mocking was not just a petty gesture, but a deep, spiritual symbol of the division that would define the descendants of these two brothers for generations to come. Sarai, Isaac's mother, could not bear the thought of Ishmael sharing in the inheritance meant for Isaac. Her concern was not only for Isaac's immediate future, but for the long-term fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. In her anger and jealousy, she demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be cast out of their home, forcing them to leave. Sarai's words echoed the deep-seated belief that Isaac, the child of promise, must not be overshadowed by Ishmael, who had been born of human effort and doubt. At this moment, the story could have taken a tragic turn, with Abraham forced to choose between his two sons. However, God intervened with a powerful message to Abraham, instructing him to listen to Sarah, for God's covenant would pass through Isaac, not Ishmael. In Genesis 21:12, God reassured Abraham, saying, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." This divine command to exile Ishmael was not about a rejection of Ishmael as a person, but about the fulfillment of God's divine plan. While God had promised to bless Ishmael and make him into a great nation, the covenant, God's special redemptive promise, would pass through Isaac. The separation of these two sons was necessary for the fulfillment of God's purpose in history. The decision to send Hagar and Ishmael away was not easy for Abraham. He loved his son, and this was an act of profound pain. But Abraham obeyed God's command, and with a heavy heart, he sent Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness, fully aware that their lives would be hard, and that this was not a decision born of personal desire, but of God's will. As Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the desert, they faced extreme hardship. The water in their skin ran out, and Hagar, desperate and near the point of death, placed Ishmael under a bush, unable to bear seeing him suffer. In this moment of hopelessness, God once again intervened. he spoke to Hagar, revealing himself as the one who sees and cares for the broken and rejected. In Genesis 21:17, God called to Hagar, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there." God opened Hagar's eyes, showing her a well of water, providing for her and Ishmael's survival. God's promise to make Ishmael a great nation was reaffirmed. Even in their rejection, Ishmael and his descendants were not forsaken. God had a plan for them, even though they were not part of the covenant. This moment, however, marks a significant turning point in the history of Israel and the Arab nations. Ishmael, though blessed, was not chosen to carry the covenant, and this division would create a spiritual and political fracture that continues to this day. Ishmael's descendants would not carry the inheritance of the promise made to Abraham. Instead, they would struggle for recognition, identity, and purpose, just as their forefather Ishmael had struggled with rejection and exile. The prophecy given to Hagar about Ishmael's future, that he would be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, Genesis 16:12, has been echoed through history. It is not a curse, but a divine foresight into the challenges Ishmael's descendants would face. This prophecy has been seen as both a description of the personal struggles of Ishmael and a broader reflection on the nation he would father. In the centuries following Ishmael's exile, his descendants, the Arab peoples, would struggle with the legacy of rejection. They would become a proud and resilient people, known for their warriors, traders, and prophets. Despite being blessed, they would feel the weight of their exclusion from the covenant and the promise given to Isaac. This spiritual wound would grow and fuel not just a political tension, but a theological and cultural conflict that is still playing out in the modern Arab-Israeli conflict. This division, which began with the rejection of Ishmael, was not a temporary rift, but a deep spiritual divide. The descendants of Isaac, the Jewish people, were chosen to carry the covenant. The descendants of Ishmael, though blessed, were not included in the covenant of promise. This reality lies at the heart of the ongoing conflict. Both sides claim the promise, both feel entitled to the land, but only one was given the covenant. As we reflect on this part of the story, we must ask ourselves how we respond to God's choices in our own lives. Just as Ishmael's descendants faced the tension of exclusion and rejection, we too may face moments where we feel excluded or misunderstood. Yet God's plan is always bigger than our limited perspective. In moments of hardship, we can trust that God sees us, just as he saw Hagar and Ishmael in the wilderness. The rejection of Ishmael does not mean that God's blessings were withheld from him. It means that God's purposes were fulfilled through Isaac. This lesson teaches us that God's plans are sovereign, and his choices are not based on human understanding or merit, but on divine will. We are called to trust in his timing and in his greater purpose for our lives. The consequences of rejection were felt in the lives of these two sons, but the broader implications were felt throughout history. The struggle between Isaac and Ishmael, between the descendants of promise and the descendants of blessing, became the root of a conflict that still rages today. It's a conflict that goes beyond territory, oil, or politics. It is a struggle over divine inheritance and the legacy of God's promises. The division between Isaac and Ishmael is a reminder that God's will is always accomplished, even through hardship and rejection. The story of Ishmael's exile and the prophecy over him highlights God's sovereign plan for the nations and his purpose in redemption. This struggle between two brothers has been mirrored in the struggles of their descendants and will continue until Christ's return. 3. The rise of Islam, rewriting the covenant and the birth of conflict. Centuries passed after the division between Isaac and Ishmael, and history moved on with the rise and fall of empires. But the conflict between the descendants of these two brothers never truly faded. In the 7th century, a significant shift occurred when Islam emerged as a new religious and political force, one that would profoundly reshape the Middle East and the world. Muhammad, a man from the Arabian Peninsula, arose as the prophet of Islam. Claiming to receive revelations from God through the angel Gabriel, Muhammad's message rewrote much of the narrative of Abraham's family history. Islam's foundational texts, the Quran, reject the notion that Isaac was the rightful heir of Abraham's promise. Instead, they argue that it was Ishmael, the firstborn son, who should have received the covenant. This interpretation is significant because it directly challenges the biblical account, altering the historical understanding of who was chosen to carry forward God's promises. In Islam's retelling of the story, it was Ishmael, not Isaac, who was nearly sacrificed by Abraham. The story of the binding of Isaac, which is central to the Jewish and Christian faiths, is substituted by the claim that Abraham offered Ishmael. This theological shift in the Quran, while subtle, has deep spiritual and political implications. By shifting the focus from Isaac to Ishmael, the Quran essentially reassigns the covenant, positioning the descendants of Ishmael as the true heirs of Abraham's promise. This assertion is at the heart of the ideological conflict between Israel and the Arab world. The claim of Ishmael as the legitimate heir is not merely a theological point. It became the foundation of the Arab identity within Islam. For centuries, the Arabs saw themselves as a people who had been overlooked, denied their rightful place in the divine plan. The rise of Islam was, in many ways, an attempt to reclaim that which they believed had been taken from them, the covenant and the land promised to Abraham and his descendants. As Muhammad's message spread rapidly across the Arabian Peninsula and beyond, it brought with it not only a new faith, but also a political movement. The Muslim world, united by the belief in the Quran's reinterpretation of the Abrahamic covenant, began to conquer vast territories. By the end of the 7th century, Islamic armies had seized Jerusalem, a city of profound religious significance to both Jews and Christians. The Dome of the Rock, one of the most iconic symbols of Islamic architecture, was built on the site traditionally believed to be where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac. This was a direct theological statement. The Islamic world claimed not only the land, but the legacy of the covenant. However, this claim to the covenant is deeply contested by Jews and Christians, for whom the land and the promise of God's covenant are inseparable from the descendants of Isaac. For Jews, Jerusalem remains the eternal capital, the city chosen by God as a symbol of his presence among his people. For Christians, the promise of redemption through Jesus Christ is rooted in the fulfillment of God's covenant with the people of Israel, a covenant that Christians believe reached its pinnacle through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the promised Messiah. This contestation of the covenant's legitimacy, with Islam declaring Ishmael as the rightful heir, has led to a spiritual and theological battle that continues to define the Arab-Israeli conflict. At its core, this is not just a dispute over territory or political power. It is a fight over inheritance, over who is the true heir of the promises made to Abraham. And that battle is still playing out in the Middle East today, as both the Arab and Israeli worlds lay claim to the same land, each with their own religious justification. For Muslims, the rise of Islam and its claim to the Abrahamic covenant is an act of spiritual restoration. The Prophet Muhammad is seen not as a new figure, but as the final prophet in a long line of prophets, including Moses and Jesus. In Islam, Muhammad is believed to have come to correct the perceived distortions in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, which they argue have misrepresented the true history of Abraham's family. While Christianity acknowledges the importance of the covenant made with Israel, it also teaches that through Christ, the promises of God are extended to all who believe, both Jews and Gentiles. The conflict between Isaac and Ishmael, though deeply rooted in history, is ultimately transcended by the message of the gospel. Christians believe that the true heir to the promise is not determined by biological descent, but by faith in Jesus Christ, who fulfills the law and the prophets. This theological tension between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity over the legitimacy of the Abrahamic covenant is not just academic, it has real-world consequences. It shapes the identities of nations, fuels political ideologies, and drives conflict in the Middle East. The claim to the land is a deeply spiritual matter for all three faiths, each of which interprets the promise of Abraham in its own way. As we reflect on the rise of Islam and its redefinition of the covenant, we must ask ourselves how we, as believers in Christ, understand our role in this conflict. It is important to recognize that as Christians we are called to bring the message of peace through Christ to all people, regardless of their background or beliefs. The conflict between Isaac and Ishmael, between Jews and Arabs, is a conflict over more than land. It is a conflict over the truth of God's promises and the role of Christ in fulfilling them. In this scene, we see that the rise of Islam and its claim to the covenant is not simply a political movement, but a theological response to centuries of exclusion. The Arab world's identity, as shaped by the descendants of Ishmael, finds its spiritual foundation in Islam's assertion that they are the true heirs of Abraham's promise. But for Christians, the true fulfillment of the promise comes through Christ, who offers salvation to all who believe in him. 4. The clash of two nations, the Jewish and Arab claims to the promise. The Middle East has been a hotbed of conflict for millennia, but the Arab-Israeli conflict stands out as one of the most deeply rooted and complex disputes. It is a battle over more than just territory. It is a battle for identity, for legacy, and for divine promise. The tension between the Jewish and Arab peoples is not merely political, it is spiritual, anchored in centuries-old beliefs and biblical narratives. At the heart of this conflict lies the land of Israel, the Promised Land. Both Jews and Arabs claim it as their rightful inheritance, each tracing their lineage to the same father, Abraham. But the key difference is this: while both sides claim Abraham as their ancestor, only one group holds the covenant that God made with him. The promise of the land, the nation, and the blessing was given specifically to Abraham's son Isaac, not to Ishmael. In Genesis 15, God promises Abraham that his descendants will inherit the land of Canaan, a promise that is reaffirmed in Genesis 17, where God tells Abraham that his covenant will be established through Isaac. This promise, which is central to the identity of the Jewish people, includes not only the land, but the nation that will arise from it, a people who will be the bearers of God's covenant and his laws. For the Jewish people, this covenant is sacred. It is a divine election, a mark of God's favor and the foundation of their faith. The land of Israel is not just a geographical location, it is the symbol of God's faithfulness to his promises. From the time of the Exodus to the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948, the Jewish people have fought to reclaim their homeland, driven by the belief that God had set them apart to inherit the land and fulfill his covenant. But the Arab world, particularly the descendants of Ishmael, has a different perspective. Islam teaches that Ishmael, the firstborn son of Abraham, was the rightful heir to the covenant. In the Quran, the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of his son is retold, but with a significant difference. The son to be sacrificed is not Isaac, but Ishmael. This reinterpretation serves to elevate Ishmael's status and claim to the inheritance that, according to Jewish and Christian tradition, rightfully belongs to Isaac. The rise of Islam in the 7th century, with its claim to be the true bearer of Abraham's covenant, set the stage for centuries of conflict. The spread of Islam across the Middle East and North Africa brought with it the assertion that the descendants of Ishmael were the true heirs of the Abrahamic promise. This belief became the foundation of the Arab world's identity as they sought to reclaim what they believed had been stolen from them, the covenant and the land. For centuries, the land of Israel was under Muslim control, particularly after the Islamic caliphates conquered it in the 7th century. Jerusalem, a city of great significance to both Jews and Christians, became a central point of contention. For Muslims, Jerusalem is the third holiest city in Islam, and the Dome of the Rock stands as a symbol of their spiritual connection to the land. For Jews, however, Jerusalem is the eternal capital, the city where the temple once stood, and the center of their worship. The conflict between Jews and Arabs over the land of Israel is not merely territorial, it is theological. Each side believes that God has promised them the land, and each side points to their respective scriptures to justify their claim. The Jewish people see the land as their divine inheritance, while the Arab world views it as a land that was wrongfully taken from them. This theological divide fuels not only political tension but also deep-seated animosity, as both sides believe they are in the right and neither is willing to relinquish their claim. This battle over the land is not just about borders, it is about the fulfillment of God's promises. The land of Israel is seen as the stage on which God's covenant with Abraham is played out. For the Jews, the land is a sign of God's faithfulness and his plan for the redemption of the world. For the Arabs, it represents a lost inheritance, a promise that was taken from them and given to another. And as these two peoples continue to clash over the land, they are also clashing over the very identity of God's promise and the direction of human history. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes in Romans 9:8, "It is not the children of the flesh who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are regarded as descendants." This statement highlights the distinction between those who are physically descended from Abraham and those who inherit the promises of God by faith. For Christians, the ultimate fulfillment of God's covenant with Abraham is found in Jesus Christ, who brings salvation to all people, regardless of their ethnic or spiritual heritage. But for the Jewish and Arab peoples, the struggle is not just about faith, it is about identity. Both sides believe they are the true heirs of Abraham's promise, and this belief shapes their sense of self, their connection to the land, and their place in God's plan. The conflict, therefore, is not merely political. It is deeply spiritual, rooted in the belief that each side holds the key to God's promises and the destiny of the world. As Christians, we must understand that the resolution of this conflict will not come through political negotiations or military victories. True peace can only come through the Prince of Peace, Jesus Christ, who brings reconciliation between Jews and Arabs and between all people through his death and resurrection. Until Christ returns to establish his kingdom, the division between Isaac's and Ishmael's descendants will remain. However, as believers, we are called to pray for peace and reconciliation, not just on a political level, but on a spiritual level. We must pray that both Jews and Arabs come to recognize the fulfillment of God's promises in Jesus Christ. Until that happens, the conflict will remain unresolved, as both sides continue to claim the promises of Abraham while rejecting the fulfillment of those promises in Christ. 5. The rise of modern conflict, the Arab-Israeli war, and prophetic fulfillment. Since the founding of the modern state of Israel in 1948, the Arab-Israeli conflict has only intensified. Over the decades, multiple wars, peace attempts, and negotiations have attempted to resolve the tension, but the heart of the conflict remains unchanged. This struggle, rooted in ancient promises and divine election, has continued into the present day. To understand the depth of the conflict and why it is not easily resolved, we must look at the prophetic fulfillment and the deeper spiritual dynamics at play. The modern conflict began with the 1948 Declaration of Israel's independence. Following World War II and the Holocaust, the international community supported the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. However, the surrounding Arab nations, unwilling to accept the legitimacy of Israel as a Jewish state, immediately launched a military campaign to wipe it off the map. This marked the beginning of a series of wars, territorial disputes, and ongoing hostilities between Israel and its Arab neighbor. One of the central aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict is the question of who has the right to the land. The Jewish people, having returned to their ancestral homeland after nearly 2,000 years of exile, see the land as their divine inheritance, promised to them through God's covenant with Abraham and his descendants. For Israel, the establishment of their nation was not just a political act, but a fulfillment of God's promises to the Jewish people. On the other hand, the Arab world, particularly the Palestinian people, view themselves as the rightful owners of the land. They point to centuries of Arab presence in the region and the claim of descent from Abraham's first son, Ishmael. The tension between these two groups is not merely a matter of borders, it is a theological and spiritual struggle over God's promises and who holds the covenant. The conflict is prophetic in nature as well. In Zechariah 12:2-3, the prophet speaks of a time when Jerusalem will become a cup of trembling for all the surrounding nations, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. This prophecy points to a time when Jerusalem will be at the center of global conflict, with the nations of the world aligning against the city. This is exactly what we have seen throughout modern history, as wars over Jerusalem and Israel's right to exist continue to rage. Despite numerous peace efforts, the conflict remains unresolved, and Jerusalem continues to be the focal point of both the Jewish and Arab claims. Ezekiel 38, 8-16 prophesies that in the latter days all nations will gather against Israel. This prophecy paints a picture of a great battle where Israel will be isolated, surrounded by its enemies. Despite this, God declares that He will intervene, bringing judgment upon those who seek to destroy His people. This is a clear indication that the ultimate resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict will not come through human efforts, but through divine intervention. One of the most significant aspects of the conflict is the battle over Jerusalem. Both Jews and Arabs claim the city as their own, but for vastly different reasons. For Jews, Jerusalem is not just a city. It is the center of their worship, their history, and their identity as a people chosen by God. Jerusalem is where the temple stood, where God's presence dwelt among His people, and where the Messiah is prophesied to return. For Muslims, Jerusalem holds significant religious importance as the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is considered the third holiest site in Islam. This creates a volatile and unresolvable dispute over the city's ownership and control. The rise of Islam in the 7th century was another factor that contributed to the deepening conflict. Muhammad, claiming descent from Ishmael, sought to reframe the Abrahamic narrative. In Islam, it is Ishmael, not Isaac, who is the true heir to God's promises. The Quran asserts that the covenant was passed down through Ishmael's line, and that the land of Israel is rightfully theirs. This theological claim stands in direct opposition to the Jewish understanding of the covenant, where the promise passed through Isaac, not Ishmael. The result is a clash not just over territory, but over the very understanding of God's will and the rightful heirs to His promises. As the conflict continues, the world watches with bated breath, hoping for peace. But the spiritual and theological divide remains vast. Many attempts have been made at peace talks, from the Camp David Accords in 1978 to the Oslo Accords in 1993, yet the conflict endures. Each time a ceasefire is reached, it is fragile, and the underlying issues that drive the conflict, spiritual, theological, and historical, remain unresolved. Ultimately, the conflict will not be resolved through politics alone. Zechariah 12:9 states that God will defend Jerusalem and fight for His people. The ultimate resolution will come when Christ returns to establish His kingdom, bringing an end to all conflict and division. Until that day, the war will continue, fueled by ancient promises and prophecies, but with the hope that one day the Prince of Peace will reign and true reconciliation will be achieved, not through treaties, but through divine intervention. As Christians, we are called to pray for peace, but not just for a political settlement. We must pray for the spiritual awakening of both the Jewish and Arab peoples, that they may come to recognize the fulfillment of God's promises in Jesus Christ. The Arab-Israeli conflict is not just a political struggle, it is a spiritual battle over the fulfillment of God's covenant, and the ultimate peace will only come when Christ returns to reconcile all things. Conclusion. As we've explored in this video, the Arab-Israeli conflict is far more than a territorial dispute. It's a profound spiritual and theological battle that has been brewing for thousands of years. Rooted in ancient promises made by God to Abraham and his descendants, this conflict transcends borders, politics, and even religion. It is about divine election, inheritance, and the fulfillment of God's will. From the very beginning, the rivalry between Isaac and Ishmael set the stage for a tension that would ripple through history, influencing nations, shaping empires, and fueling ideological wars. The struggles between the Jewish and Arab peoples and their competing claims to the land of Israel are not merely the result of political decisions, but are deeply intertwined with prophecy. The Bible makes it clear that the ultimate resolution of this conflict will not come through human efforts or diplomatic treaties, but through divine intervention when Christ returns. As believers, we must understand that the true answer to the Arab-Israeli conflict lies in Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. It is only through his sacrifice on the cross that true reconciliation can be achieved. The promise of peace for both Jews and Arabs is found not in politics but in the gospel, and it is our calling as Christians to pray for both peoples, that they may come to know Christ as the true fulfillment of God's promises. The war may continue, but we know that one day when Christ returns, he will bring lasting peace, and the lion will lie down with the lamb. Until that day, let us remain faithful, praying for peace, sharing the gospel, and trusting in God's perfect timing for the resolution of this age-old conflict. If this video has opened your eyes to the deeper spiritual layers of the Arab-Israeli conflict, we encourage you to like, share, and subscribe. Let us continue to seek peace and understanding through the lens of Scripture. What are your thoughts on how we as Christians can contribute to peace in the world today? Join the conversation in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video to help others understand the deeper truths at play in global conflicts.